when we discuss the diversity of life, there are three major groups that we can divide all living things into. Those are referred to as domains. Those three domains are currently recognized as the highest taxonomic groups, and those include the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukaryotes. We can represent those groups either in simple lineages and just by three branches on a phylogenetic tree, or we can show more detail without changing any of the relationships amongst those three branches. As we're starting to consider the diversity of life, one important feature to consider is the root. The last universal common ancestor is the most recent common ancestor of everything that's alive today, at least in the current supported hypothesis. And what that means is that all the current data suggest that life arose one time and then differentiated from there, evolved into new forms from there, creating different groups, but that all shared one single origin. One of the things that differentiates those groups is a ribosome structure. We know quite a bit about ribosome structure, and it was one of the things that in the 1970s began to provide clues about how those groups are separated. Ribosomes are responsible for carrying out the instructions that are part of our nucleic acids, that are part of our hereditary material in all cells. So the structure of those ribosomes, as well as the sequences of nucleic acids involved in them, is an important part of recognizing those three major groups. To put it very, very simply, bacteria have fewer parts, that is, subunits of the ribosome. The archaea have more subunits, and the eukaryotes have more subunits as well. So, when we go back to those three domains, we can also group them into two separate categories that have been around for a little bit longer and that a lot of people still recognize and are important in the way that we think about them. One is the prokaryotes and one is the eukaryotes. These are based on the cell structure. So let's take a little bit closer look at that cell structure. So all cells that we're aware of are surrounded by a phospholipid bilayer. Bi just means two. There are two layers around the cell. One that faces in, one that faces out, and it creates a sort of capsule that separates those cells from their environment. So inside of that, there's a chromosome that contains information that is organized by a set of proteins, but that contains information in nucleic acids. And in the bacteria and the archaea, the prokaryotes, that chromosome is circular. That doesn't mean that it forms a perfect circle. What it means is that it's attached end to end, and then it's folded up. These organisms can also contain a plasmid that has extra DNA, extra information that can lead to some other functions, and those can be passed around in some special and unique ways. As we think about these groups, one of the things that differentiates the Archaeans from both the bacteria and the eukaryotes is that those two layers that surround their cells have some unique parts. They have a chemical called isoprene in their tails. Also separating the prokaryotes from the eukaryotes is the way that their flagella work. So their flagella move in a circular manner, and that can propel cells through the environment, etc. So that's distinct from the way that eukaryotic cells work. Let's zoom in and take a look at eukaryotic cells. The name itself actually refers to a second membrane within the cell that separates out the hereditary material from the rest of the cell. Inside that separate membrane are the chromosomes. Those chromosomes have DNA in a straight line, and it's sort of like a ribbon. And that ribbon is sort of wadded up and maintained in place by some proteins. So there's a structure, and at certain parts of the cell cycle that structure is very visible. At other times it's less visible. But it serves to separate out and organize the hereditary material within that nucleus, within that separate membrane within the cell. What's also interesting is that eukaryotes have a variety of organelles. Probably the most famous is the mitochondrion. So mitochondria have a circular chromosome as well. And of course everyone knows the phrase that is close to describing the function of the mitochondria, and it's the powerhouse of the cell, right? It was made famous in a lot of education, and it makes a lot of sense, although we might want to add a little bit of nuance to it. So the mitochondria are also separated from the rest of the cell in another membrane, and that's important in current hypotheses about where the mitochondria came from and why they exist in the cell. Also, the flagella that are contained in eukaryotic cells move and work differently. I'm not going to go into the details, but they have a very different structure, and ultimately they move cells around by whipping back and forth, rather than in a circular motion in the eukaryotes. So, one of the major groups of eukaryotes is kind of a taxonomic nightmare, and it's called the protist. The protists. And the protists include basically everything but some of the most familiar eukaryotes to us. The protists have all sorts of different organisms that are interesting and have a lot of diversity. It includes things like kelp and slime molds and lots of algae. And those are all parts of that group. The thing that's confusing about the protists and what makes it sort of bad taxonomy is that it excludes some of the groups within it. It excludes the fungi, the animals, and the land plants. So as you can see from this part of the phylogenetic tree, here are the eukaryotes, right? And that includes all the protists as well as the familiar fungi, animals, and land plants. So if we can call out all of these protist lineages, and we can also identify within them the non-protists. So the fungi include things like mushrooms and the shelf fungus that you might see in the woods on trees, and other things like bread mold, and even the single-celled yeasts that make beer. And then there are the animals. We're familiar with that group, and sometimes people are surprised to learn that there are some simple animals like sponges and jellyfish that are part of that group. And then there are the land plants, and that's a separate group as well that includes things like mosses and trees and ferns, and it has a lot of interesting diversity there, and we'll talk about that separately later. It's interesting that as we look at the lineage that leads to the land plants, that there are a couple of other things that you should be aware of. Maybe the most important is that there's a chloroplast that's gotten incorporated from other parts of the phylogenetic tree, from other organisms. And that, like the mitochondrion, is separated out from the rest of the cell in a separate membrane, and it also has a circular chromosome within it. Again, like the mitochondrion, that helps us to understand the origin of that particular organelle. So as we zoom back out, this sort of puts all of the tree of life into context. But remember, even though there's a lot of complexity there, we can still boil it down to just those 3 branches, and that can help us to make it a little bit easier. At the end of this video, you should be able to identify some of the things that differentiate those branches from one another, and you should be able to talk about the structures that you could potentially recognize that are different in each of those branches from each of the others. Thanks for listening and have a great day.